Um, my name is Alan East, and I am the festival programmer for the Desperado LGBTQ Film Festival. Just thank you for being here for this art discussion. We really appreciate it. We're going to use this discussion during our film festival to highlight Keith Haring documentary and hopefully get people involved in the art and film community. So I'm going to turn it over to Tomi Johnston. She will go from here. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so thank you very much for organizing this discussion panel on Keith Haring, Street Art Boy. So I just want to very briefly introduce myself, and then I'm going to have all of you introduce yourselves as well. So my name is Tomi Johnston. I'm the art history faculty for Paradise Valley Community College. And I am the person to contact if you're interested in taking art history classes at Paradise Valley. But I will go ahead and hand it on to Marilyn Cristiano.
Hello, I am a retired full-time communication faculty from Paradise Valley Community College. It's going to be 2 years in January that I've retired, so it's time flies. And I've been part of Desperado for many, many years now, and I enjoyed this film so much and excited to talk about it.
Okay, thank you. Loomis.
Yes.
Introduce yourself and your fabulous brand.
Well, my name's Loomis Henry, existential crisis counselor, art supply addict. I have a brand called Sketch and Destroy. It began as a silk screening and t-shirt brand and has subsequently branched out into fine art prints that are sold all over the world, and they are reimagined. The content is reimagined icons, intellectual thinkers, writers, poets, artists from the past, and I kind of modernize them and recontextualize them. And that's that.
And Christina.
Yeah, hi, I'm Christina. I am a local artist here based in Phoenix, and I was so fortunate and honored to be chosen as the featured artist at last year's Desperado Film Festival.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, it's really sad that we don't get to have a featured artist this year because being virtual. All right. Well, so I thought I would just make some opening comments. I really enjoyed the film quite a bit, and I learned a lot. Of course, I was very familiar with Keith Haring's work, you know, from the 80s, which was kind of my coming of age decade. So it was really fun to revisit his artworks and, you know, just remember, you know, that period in time. Oh, Kelly's just joined us. So once she gets in, I'll have her introduce herself too. But one of the things that I was thinking about, you know, so this is the year that marks 30 years since Keith Haring passed away. So I think this documentary is really well timed in that it gives us a chance to reassess his work and look back at it. But one of the things that I was thinking about in watching this film is trying to separate out the nostalgia versus like a critical assessment, because I mean, you know, I have so many memories of having his t-shirts and posters, and you know, he was just so ubiquitous in the 80s. So it was really fun to see all of his work again, and also to learn a lot about his personal life, which I didn't know, like his growing up, his background. So all of that was, or a lot of that was new information for me. So, so anyway, I wanted to get some of you guys' impressions about what that was like for you and re-experiencing his artwork after, you know, a few decades since he's passed. So anybody want to?
Hi,
Hi.
this is Kelly.
Yeah, Kelly, can you just briefly introduce yourselves? We've already gone around and done that, so.
I'm sorry. My name is Kelly Roche, and I am turning 50 next week, and I am going back to school and starting over and loving it.
Yes, she's a student here at Paradise Valley Community College.
Yes.
Well, we can start talking about the movie itself, and how you feel it did its job as far as telling the story. I found it really compelling. And another thing that I found really interesting that I thought about, something we could talk about, is the late 70s and early 80s were really interesting as far as a time period for artists, because you had both in New York and in Los Angeles at the same time these two major urban centers in the United States that were centers of art and culture that also, you know, had a little bit of that urban decay going on. And so rents were really cheap, and, you know, you could live there and, you know, be in this great metropolis with all this creative energy around it. And you could afford it, you know, and that's not really that possible. Like, nobody can just go to Manhattan and, you know, and live there, and, you know, in the way that you could do that in both Los Angeles and New York City at that time. And so one of the questions I wanted to put out to you guys as the panel is thinking about, you know, so instead of having those kind of in-person centers, we do have the internet, which is very accessible and is a great creative space. You know, there's lots of communities around different art pursuits. You know, there's lots of music making that takes place, and there's lots of creative writing, and you know, a lot of art, visual art spaces. You know, as I'm sure our artists here know about. I'm just kind of curious. You know, do you think that that's something? You know, can that fill that void that we now have as far as sort of having those cultural spaces that were depicted in the film?
I don't think so.
I agree. I think that it's very difficult to experience it in the same way, to the same degree. There's no way to stand in front of a Keith Haring or a Rembrandt or anything else and see it and almost feel it, even just by standing there, as opposed to seeing it online. It's just not the same experience. It's too flat.
And also, I love the documentary how he utilized subway tunnels and the advertisements on those walls as blank canvases. And when you take that environment, most people, you know, on a subway are going to work, and they're in a very stressful environment. And the art is like a form of salvation, you see, whereas social media and these other places that may very well provide an opportunity for artists to show their work, well, typically the people that are looking at them are in a place of comfort. You're on your phone, you're in your house, so there's not that element of danger involved. And I think because that is missing, it just diminishes the whole relationship between art, the artist, and the community.
Well, and I grew up just outside Washington, D.C., and so we had access to the Hirshhorn and the National Gallery of Art, and it was always an event. You went, even if you went on a Saturday morning, you went, you had lunch, you went and walked the mall, but you knew you were going down to see something specific, and it was something we just always did, even whether it was the Kennedy Center or the Smithsonian and the experience of seeing those things online, because I've gone and done their virtual tours just to see what they're like. It is nothing like, or, the National Gallery of Art. And just, to me, I was always in awe of these artists and what they had accomplished. And, one of my favorites, and I can't remember the artist, but it was just this little tiny, like 4x4 portrait that was hanging on this huge blank wall. And it had such an impact on me because of the way it was displayed. And you just can't experience that online.
Okay, yeah. And this is something that I always stress also in my classes to my students, is that, yeah, even the most beautiful digital reproduction of something can't capture what it actually looks like in person. And I use it as an example, any work by a Van Gogh, right? Because his surfaces are so textured that any photograph just flattens it out, and so you don't see that interplay of light playing across the surface, and how those deep grooves and swirls of paint really come across in a way that like I said, even the best digital reproduction can't capture.
I would also add that in Herring's case, the element of surprise plays a huge role in his work, because the entire city was his canvas. And so when you go to a gallery, there's the expectation and anticipation that you are going to be engaged in art. Whereas like Banksy, for example, when you're defacing the side of a building, where typically you wouldn't be exposed to a art or a form of expression on that scale, it's very, very vivid and visceral. It's like, whoa. And that, I think, is magic.
I would agree. And I would go a step further, where they discussed how he went and he cleaned up all the trash. But that not too long after he put that up, all that trash was back. So it was this spot of beauty and enlightenment right there in the middle of this really depressing place, where there was needles and garbage everywhere. And I think that was one of the things that made him so different. And the fact that he appreciated street art so much and wanted to contribute and wanted to learn from them and those artists, and asked questions and engaged with them, didn't just take what he saw and did his own thing, but he wanted to learn about them, and he wanted to learn why they did what they did and how. And I think that was amazing.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, and that was another thing I kind of wanted to touch on, is because it was also in the late 70s, early 80s when street art really started to become, be taken seriously. I mean, obviously street art has always existed ever since we started making art, but there was this idea that came to be recognized in that time period. And I really think Keith Haring's a great example of this, where it was recognized that it wasn't just vandalism, right? There were things in there that were important, messages that were important, and real creativity, and so you had people like Basquiat and Fab Five Freddy and Kenny Sharp and all those people that, like you said, Keith Haring kind of bridged that. He wanted to be part of it, and then also I think he had this idea of taking it further, and sort of making it more accessible to people, because it was kind of a code, right? It was kind of a little bit of an insular community, and I think in some ways there's kind of interesting parallels between, you know, modern art and street art being these kind of closed communities. You know, like you have to be educated about modern art to understand it and appreciate it, right? And they kind of touched on this in the film. And then again, you know, initially street art was kind of a closed community where you had to know the people and be part of the culture to really fully read the iconography that was there. But then, you know, I think people like Keith Haring kind of opened that up and made it so that everybody could appreciate, or at least more people could appreciate what was going on, and the importance of that media.
Well, and I think because he brought it a little bit more mainstream, he made it okay to appreciate it. And I think that was a big thing, that culturally he said, this is okay, this should be appreciated, as opposed to, oh, look, that's different. Am I supposed to like that? He allowed people to investigate it more and read more into it on their own, because he invited people into that space. At least that's how I understood. And I remember the first time I saw a Keith Haring, I was 16 in a restaurant, and it was hanging in the restaurant. And I was so impacted by it. And after that, I started paying more attention to those types of images, things that had, they weren't necessarily graffiti because it wasn't just something scribbled on the wall, but things that were bigger, things that I hadn't noticed before in DC, but when we would go down, all of a sudden I would notice it. And I really think it was the impact that the first time I saw Keith Haring had on me. I think it made me appreciate the street art more.
I also think it's important to remember too how his artwork was energized by the beginnings of hip hop and club culture. And I remember when I was exposed to his work early, you know, in the mid '80s. It was through that relationship between his work and the counterculture music scene in a lot of urban areas, and I love that they had that connection, that his work, you know, was loved and just energized again by music, and vice versa. You know, they all the b-boys and the hip hop artists and the break dancers, it was just this whole counterculture thing happening. It was just really multidimensional.
Yeah, and that was another issue that I was thinking about with the movie, and they kind of touched on it in the movie too, about whether his, I don't know if you want to call it cultural appropriation, but you know, his inspiration coming from that, you know, it was that, you know, we call it cultural appropriation, right? And sometimes we, you know, it gets labeled as problematic, right? You know, kind of like Elvis singing rock and roll and, you know, making millions while, you know, the black performers, you know, remain poor, right? And so this, so I find it really interesting that that I don't know, I wonder, like, has our society kind of hardened in a way that we're not as willing to experiment and cross cultural boundaries and cross ethnic boundaries, you know, and you know, have we lost a little bit of freedom, artistic freedom, in the name of I don't know, worry about, you know, well, you know, that belongs to those people. I don't know if I'm making it clear.
I think you're making yourself clear. And I think one thing we've lost is sometimes it's not necessarily appropriation, but appreciation. And when someone like Keith Haring, he didn't just want to use their art. He wanted to learn about their art. He wanted to experience their art. He wanted to get to know their culture. He wanted to get to know those people. He appreciated them. and he was compassionate and empathetic to them, and he wanted to make a difference for them. And I think that that shows more appreciation, in my opinion, as opposed to appropriation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, but I guess what I'm wondering is, would he be criticized today, 30 years later?
I think he would be. I think he would be.
Yeah. I think it's kind of an interesting question to ponder, because
well, and I think you saw a little bit of that in the movie when he was in Australia, and they said that's Aboriginal art, and they threw bricks through it. They did not appreciate that they felt that he stole that from them, and it was something he developed here, not even knowing anything about their art. So it really wasn't appropriation, in my opinion. He had his own style that happened to be very similar, but they didn't see it that way. So I think it did affect him even then.
Yeah.
He even talked about that.
Mhm.
And then, of course, I really feel like you can't, discuss Keith Haring without discussing the AIDS epidemic, and the loss that we experienced culturally by, almost an entire generation of creative people were devastated. Because even if they didn't actually die of AIDS themselves, the constant grief and mourning that was going on in the community, so severely impacted the entire community at that time. And I feel like it's kind of weird to me that we almost never talk about it from the standpoint of it having impacted the arts so much, and so many careers were cut short.
I can bring that home a little bit. I had a cousin. He was probably about 5 years younger than me. He was an artist in New York, in the Village, and he mostly did music album covers. And Grace Jones was one of his artists who he worked with, and he did die of AIDS in the late 80s, and it was absolutely devastating. And I had a second cousin who was gay, lived in New York, and he was an associate or a director, mostly for pageants, Miss America, Miss Universe, and that kind of thing. And he did not die of AIDS. He actually lived a long life, well into his 80s. But at that time, he moved out of New York. He said that he just couldn't go to one more funeral. And so it was a very, very devastating time.
Well, and I think too, we've lost touch with that whole era. I'm not sure that my children or any kids today have any concept of what it was like or how it impacted the whole world. I don't think it's discussed.
Yeah, and that seems kind of odd to me. I mean, obviously, we still talk about, the AIDS epidemic and a lot of the social things that surrounds it, but it's kind of interesting to me that kind of, at least from what I have observed, the creative community mourns, but still hasn't really, I don't know. There's a hurt there that doesn't seem to be really expressed a lot. It's kind of like maybe it was a case of grief exhaustion. And maybe it just, maybe it's a situation where time did have to go by before that could be more fully explored. I don't know. But I found that really interesting. And then the other thing, and this was something that I found particularly touching about the movie, was his, he was so lucky I think, to have the parental support that he had. You know, that them talking about how his parents held him in their arms as he passed, when so many of the victims were disowned, you know,
They died alone.
died alone. They weren't allowed to have their longtime companions with them, you know, at the end, because there was no legal status. So I mean, obviously it's a real tragedy, but I was just so happy to hear that that he had that support and he had that love, you know. But
Well, he did, but they also pointed out in the movie how the wealthy and the rich and famous that he had gotten so involved with just deserted him. They just dropped him like a hot potato. And it, you know, he was lucky that he had that close-knit group of friends and family that truly loved him, that he truly loved back, that were able to help get him through that. Because from what they were saying in the movie, I got the feeling that that was very devastating to him, that he felt deserted.
mm-hmm.
I mean, they didn't specifically say that, but, you know, they alluded to it. And I thought that that was very, for a community that was supposed to be so understanding and forgiving, they sure weren't understanding or forgiving in that point. You know, I think they allowed their fear to overcome their compassion.
Yeah, well, and you know, sadly, this was a time when, you know, for A-listers, if you want to call them that, you know, being outed was potentially a career killer.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was cool to have gay friends, but it wasn't cool to, like, you know,
To be gay.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when I look back, I remember when the first time someone told me that it was supposed to be wrong to be gay, and it was not something that I grew up believing or understanding, and it shocked me. So to me, I didn't understand the stigma that was attached to being gay or having AIDS and it being a quote unquote gay disease. Because at the time, early 80s, you know, it was a gay person's disease. And I just didn't understand the stigma because the world I grew up in, it was nothing unusual with being gay. So I didn't understand that.
lucky you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was just the world I grew up in. You know, there was gay people all around me, and they were nice, wonderful people, and so, you know.
Yeah, yeah, it is interesting how in the film it did depict that. It showed that the family came together, but you're right. The creative community that was around him seemed to be more interested in how much money they could make off of him. That makes sense,
Yes.
I think. And I just thought that was probably very typical for the time for artists who were, you know, the LGBTQ community. I think maybe that they were more looked on as creative, artistic types, and they want to be shown in galleries and things like that. But actually bringing them into your life, considering them your part of your family or being close to them, I don't think that happened as much. It was still very counterculture back then.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a very club thing, you know. It was, I remember in the late 80s when I went to visit New York, and it was the first time I'd ever been to any kind of big club. I mean, I'd been to small clubs, but the first time I'd been to a big club, and it was crazy, and it was dance and house music, and it was just insane. And the stuff going on around me was, I thought I was worldly. Ha! No, the energy was completely different. And I understand why he was so drawn to that world and that energy and that life. And I think you're right. I think everything was very counterculture at that point in his life. Everything he did, from drawing on the black pieces of paper to being gay to embracing the club culture to saying, I think everyone should have art.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting too to consider that whole Reagan's America and in the political history of this country, where he was like this ex-movie star, and he's one of the first presidents to vocally link himself to the moral majority and kind of, you know, marry religion and politics in a way that goes against, you know, what the founding fathers intended. And so he was this huge antagonist. And I think the counterculture that blossomed under the 8 years that he was president was really unlike anything we've witnessed subsequently. Because again, there are gay human beings that are being essentially marginalized and even persecuted by the top leadership in this country. And so they create this counterculture movement on this gorgeous audacity to overstate their identities in the most colorful, vibrant way. And I just wonder, like, if Jimmy Carter had another 4 years and Reagan never won that first term, would there have been such a vibrant counterculture?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I think you're right. He was very, you're right. He definitely used the government's marketing machine to, as a tool, definitely for his voters to get reelected, for people on, you know, on his same wavelength to get elected across the country, because it was a very, it was a tough time for us.
Yeah. Well, and also, I know we're running out of time, but I find it really interesting that, you know, they specifically chose not to address AIDS because it was a gay disease, or, you know, they considered it a gay disease. So they, you know, they intentionally let the crisis blossom, you know, and they deserve it and they deserve to die. And I mean, that was really the message. And then now we're living through a pandemic where we're finding out that the current administration did not address the coronavirus because they felt that it was going to mostly impact the people that they disapprove of. You know, it was mostly going to be a blue state disease, you know, is what the administration admitted, that it's in their documents. And so we kind of see this disturbing cycle kind of repeating, except, you know, on an even bigger scale 30 years later.
Minus the counterculture.
Yeah, minus the counterculture, unfortunately. Yeah. And unless we all get busy, you know, creating art, which we probably should be doing. And just, you know, I wanted to mention this too, you know, talking about how Keith Haring, when he got his diagnosis, just went into this explosion of creativity, you know, because he wanted to, you know, I mean, all of our days are numbered, but we don't really feel that until we get a diagnosis like that. And so he just really wanted to make the most of his time. And that reminded me of a conversation I had with you, Loomis, about you feeling this sort of sense of urgency in your own work, you know, lately. And, you know, maybe we all need to get a little bit of that urgency. And, you know, because, yeah, it is true. We're all racing the clock, right?
One thing about counterculture and the times and art and all, at least The Fly got a lot of memes, the fly on Pence's head, you know, during the debate. I mean, there must have been 100, and they were pretty creative and pretty funny. I don't know what that will do to the counterculture and art, but I think it will help us all out a lot with that way. So.
Well, we have to wrap it up, sadly. So I really want to thank all of you for joining me And thank you to Alan for organizing this. And gosh, I really hope that we can do something like this again for an art-related movie, because it was really a lot of fun.
It was fun. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you, Tommy.
Thanks, and nice to meet everybody. And for our video, I would just want to say thanks to our sponsors for the film festival and for Paradise Valley Community College and Maricopa Community College is for supporting us for well over 10 years now. So thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you at the festival.
All right, thank you.